If you had $1 million to invest tomorrow, where would you put it? The question drifted across the private dining room like a joke everyone was expected to laugh at. And they did. Crystal glasses clinked. Expensive watches flashed beneath warm chandelier light. A few executives smirked into their bourbon. At the center of the table sat Ethan Caldwell, a 39-year-old billionaire whose opinions moved markets and whose signature could create or destroy companies. He leaned back in his chair, one arm resting casually against the leather booth as he looked up at the waitress standing beside him. Claire Morgan held a notepad in one hand and a water pitcher in the other. 27 years old. White apron. White shirt. Simple black uniform. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged anywhere near a conversation about finance. Ethan's smile widened slightly. Well, he asked, I'd diversify 40% into emerging market energy funds. The room fell silent. Not gradually. Instantly. The laughter stopped as if someone had flipped a switch. Claire's voice had not been loud. It had not been dramatic. She simply answered. Ethan blinked once. Then twice. The amusement remained on his face, but something behind his eyes changed. Around the table, several executives exchanged confused looks. One man slowly lowered his drink. Another stopped checking his phone. Claire remained calm. She did not appear proud of her answer. She did not seem nervous either. She merely waited to see if anyone wanted sparkling water. Ethan leaned forward. 40%? He asked. That's aggressive. Claire nodded politely. Only if you're chasing short-term certainty instead of long-term growth. A few eyebrows rose around the table. Ethan set down his glass. For the first time that evening, his full attention left his billion-dollar acquisition meeting and settled on the woman standing beside him. Interesting, he said. And the other 60%? Claire answered immediately. 30% in undervalued domestic companies with strong cash flow. 20% in municipal bonds. 10% liquid for opportunities most people won't see coming. Nobody laughed this time. The silence grew heavier. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the evening sky. Inside, every person at the table seemed to be studying the waitress. Ethan had spent years reading people. Investors. Competitors. Politicians. Founders. He knew confidence when he saw it. What unsettled him was that Claire wasn't performing confidence. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She spoke the way people spoke when they genuinely understood something. That's a surprisingly specific answer, Ethan said. Claire offered a small smile. You asked a specific question. One executive nearly choked on his drink. Ethan stared at her for a moment before letting out a quiet laugh. Fair enough. The waitress began refilling water glasses as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet Ethan found himself watching every movement. Most people changed around powerful individuals. Their voices shifted. Their posture changed. They became eager, careful, sometimes intimidated. Claire did none of those things. She moved through the room with the same calm professionalism she had shown from the moment she arrived. It bothered him more than he expected. Wait, he said as she prepared to leave. Claire stopped. Yes, sir. Ethan hated the word sir. Most people used it because they wanted something. Somehow, when Claire said it, it sounded like simple courtesy. Why emerging energy? He asked. Humor me. Claire glanced toward another table waiting for service. Then back at him. Because most investors are chasing what's already popular, she replied. The bigger opportunity is usually hiding where nobody's looking yet. Ethan's smile disappeared completely. The sentence hit him harder than it should have. Because that was exactly the philosophy that had built his fortune. Across the table, several executives were no longer pretending not to listen. Claire adjusted the water pitcher against her hip. Will there be anything else? She asked. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Somewhere beneath the polished conversations, luxury decor, and million-dollar negotiations, something had shifted. The joke was gone. The game was gone. In its place was a question he couldn't shake. Who exactly was Claire Morgan? Claire walked away carrying the water pitcher, leaving behind a silence that felt strangely heavier than the million-dollar conversations that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Ethan watched her move through the restaurant with practiced efficiency, greeting guests, delivering meals, and clearing tables with the same calm focus she had shown while discussing investment strategy. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had just surprised an entire table full of executives. That bothered him. Most people would have enjoyed the attention. Most people would have lingered. Claire seemed determined to disappear back into the background. Across the table, Richard Lawson, the chief financial officer of Ethan's company, finally leaned back in his chair. That was unusual, he said quietly. Unusual? Another executive replied. She sounded like she spends her weekends reading institutional market reports. A few nervous laughs followed. Ethan did not join them. His gaze remained fixed on the far side of the dining room, where Claire was taking an order from an elderly couple. You think she memorized it? Someone asked. Richard shook his head. No. People who memorize information sound rehearsed. She sounded like she understood it. The comment lingered in the air. Ethan picked up his glass, but did not drink. For reasons he could not explain, he kept replaying her answer in his head. The percentages, the logic, the confidence. More importantly, the complete absence of any attempt to impress him. That part stood out the most. Throughout his career, Ethan had met thousands of intelligent people. Many wanted recognition. Many wanted money. Many wanted access. Claire had wanted none of those things. 20 minutes later, she returned carrying a tray. The conversation at the table immediately shifted back toward business, but Ethan noticed several executives sitting up straighter as she approached. It was subtle, almost unconscious. Yet the change was there. People were paying attention now. Claire carefully placed the entrees in front of each guest. Ribeye medium rare, grilled salmon, filet mignon. Her voice remained warm and professional. Nothing more. Ethan waited until she set down his plate. One more question. Claire paused politely. Yes. What do you think is the biggest mistake investors make? Several executives exchanged amused looks. One of them whispered, "Here we go." Claire seemed to consider the question for a moment. Not because she needed time to think, but because she wanted to answer carefully. They confuse activity with progress. Ethan slowly lowered his fork. Around the table, conversation stopped again. Claire continued. People feel productive when they are constantly buying, selling, adjusting, reacting. Sometimes the smartest decision is simply staying patient while everyone else is panicking. Nobody spoke. Even the servers moving through the restaurant seemed distant. Ethan felt an unexpected smile tug at the corner of his mouth. It was not because she was right. It was because she had just summarized one of his most successful investment philosophies in a single sentence. Claire nodded politely. Enjoy your dinner. Then she turned and walked away. Richard stared after her. Okay, now I am curious. Ethan was curious too. More curious than he had been about any person in a very long time. The meeting continued, but his attention drifted repeatedly toward the waitress moving through the restaurant. Every time he looked, he noticed something new. The way she listened carefully before speaking. The way she treated every customer exactly the same. The way she never appeared rushed despite the crowded dining room. It was as if she possessed a quiet confidence completely independent of her surroundings. Then Ethan's phone vibrated. A message from his investment team appeared on the screen. The subject line immediately erased the faint smile from his face. One of the company's largest acquisitions was facing unexpected problems. Projected losses were climbing. Negotiations were deteriorating. Investors were demanding answers. Ethan read the message twice. The timing could not have been worse. Around him, executives noticed the shift in his expression. The room grew tense. The acquisition represented hundreds of millions of dollars. And months of planning. Ethan stared at the numbers glowing on his screen. Then, almost involuntarily, his eyes drifted across the restaurant. Claire was standing near the window, reviewing an order ticket beneath the soft golden light. For a brief moment, she looked up. Their eyes met. And for reasons he could not explain, Ethan suddenly found himself wondering what her opinion would be. The message remained open on Ethan's phone long after he finished reading it. Numbers filled the screen. Forecasts. Risk assessments. Revised projections. None of them looked good. Across the table, his executives were already beginning to speculate. Suggestions came quickly. Some wanted to pause the acquisition. Others argued for pushing forward before investors lost confidence. The discussion grew louder with every passing minute. Yet the more people talked, the less certain anyone seemed. Ethan listened without speaking. His eyes drifted back toward the dining room. Claire had returned to work as though nothing unusual had happened. She carried a tray to a nearby table, smiled politely at a family celebrating a birthday, then moved toward the kitchen doors. Calm, focused, unhurried. Meanwhile, a room full of highly paid professionals was struggling to agree on a solution. We need to make a decision tonight, Richard said. The market opens in less than 14 hours. Ethan nodded absently. Then he stood. The table immediately fell quiet. Most people expected him to deliver instructions. Instead, he surprised even himself. He walked across the restaurant. Claire was placing fresh silverware onto a table when she noticed him approaching. "Is everything all right with your meal?" she asked. Ethan glanced at the place setting before looking back at her. "Actually, I have a question." Claire smiled slightly. "Another one?" "Afraid so." Something almost resembling amusement appeared in her eyes. "All right." Ethan held up his phone. Hypothetically, if a company spent 8 months negotiating a major acquisition and suddenly discovered the projected costs were increasing much faster than expected, what would you do? Claire studied him for a moment. Not the phone. Him. As though she were trying to understand why he was asking. "Do you want the polite answer?" she asked. Ethan blinked. "There is more than one. Usually." For the first time that evening, Ethan laughed openly. "Give me the honest one." Claire set down the silverware. Most people become emotionally attached to decisions because they have already invested time and money. They stop asking whether the deal is still good and start asking how to justify continuing. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The words landed with uncomfortable precision. Claire continued, "The question is not how much time you have already spent. The question is whether you would make the same decision if the opportunity appeared for the first time today." Ethan stared at her. Around them, restaurant noise faded into the background. "And if the answer is no?" he asked quietly. Claire shrugged gently. "Then you already know the answer." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Ethan had heard consultants charge hundreds of thousands of dollars for advice that was less useful than a single sentence from a waitress carrying dinner plates. He looked down at his phone again. Suddenly, the situation appeared clearer than it had all evening. Not solved, but clearer. "You make it sound simple," he said. Claire picked up the silverware tray. Complicated situations are often built on simple truths people do not want to hear. Then she smiled politely. "Anything else, Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan almost asked who she really was. The question hovered on the edge of his thoughts. But something stopped him. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was curiosity. Whatever the reason, he simply shook his head. "No, that is enough." Claire nodded and returned to work. Ethan stood there for another moment before walking back toward his table. Every executive looked up as he approached. Richard immediately noticed the change in his expression. "What did she say?" he asked. Ethan sat down slowly. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he placed his phone on the table and looked around the room. "She asked a question nobody in this room has asked yet." Silence followed. The kind of silence that appears when people realize the conversation is about to change. Ethan leaned back in his chair. For the first time since receiving the message, he felt completely calm. And somewhere across the restaurant, Claire Morgan was already helping another customer, unaware that a single conversation had just altered the direction of a decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Richard stared at Ethan for several seconds. And what exactly was that question? Around the table, every executive waited. Ethan glanced once toward the dining room before answering. "Whether we would still make the same decision if the opportunity appeared for the first time today." The reaction was immediate. Some executives frowned. Others looked away. One quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Nobody spoke because everyone understood the implication. The acquisition had become personal. They had spent months discussing it, defending it, and presenting it to investors. Walking away now felt like admitting failure. Yet Claire's question had stripped away all the noise. Ethan looked around the table. "Forget the past 8 months," he said calmly. "Forget the negotiations. Forget the resources already spent. If this deal landed on your desk this morning exactly as it exists today, would you approve it?" Silence settled over the room. The answer was written on every face. Richard was the first to speak. "No." Another executive slowly nodded. "No." A third shook her head. "Not under these conditions." Ethan leaned back in his chair. There it was. The truth, hidden beneath weeks of meetings and endless reports. The acquisition no longer made sense. Yet nobody had wanted to be the first person to say it aloud. The discussion that followed was completely different from the one before. Voices remained calm. Numbers were reevaluated. Assumptions were challenged. For the first time all evening, progress replaced panic. Across the restaurant, Claire continued serving guests, completely unaware that a boardroom-level conversation had been transformed by a few simple observations. As the meeting moved forward, Ethan found himself paying less attention to the spreadsheets and more attention to a different question. Who was she? The curiosity refused to disappear. Near 10 o'clock, the dinner crowd began to thin. The chandeliers cast softer reflections across the polished floors. Outside the windows, the city glowed beneath a dark blue sky. Ethan's team was preparing to leave when Richard gathered his documents and paused. "I have to ask," he said. Ethan looked up. "Ask what?" Richard lowered his voice. "Who was that waitress?" Ethan almost laughed. The fact that Richard was asking proved he was not the only one wondering. "I have no idea," Ethan admitted. "But I intend to find out." Richard smiled. "Good. Because I spent 20 years in finance, and she just summarized behavioral economics better than half the consultants I have met." A few executives nearby nodded in agreement. Ethan looked across the room again. Claire was speaking with an elderly customer, listening carefully as the woman described something with animated hand gestures. Claire smiled warmly and gave the customer her full attention. There was something unusual about that, too. Most people listened while waiting for their turn to speak. Claire listened because she genuinely cared about understanding. The difference was subtle but impossible to ignore. A few minutes later, Ethan stood and buttoned his jacket. The meeting was over. The acquisition would be reassessed first thing in the morning. Potential losses had been avoided. Investors would receive updated guidance. For the first time all day, he felt optimistic. As he prepared to leave, his gaze landed on Claire one last time. She was wiping down a table near the window. Simple task. Ordinary moment. Yet she seemed completely unaffected by the attention she had received. No pride. No expectation. No attempt to capitalize on any of it. Ethan realized that was exactly what made her impossible to forget. Most people chased importance. Claire seemed entirely comfortable without it. He reached into his pocket, removed a business card, and studied it for a moment. Then he began walking across the restaurant. Because one thing had become absolutely clear. The conversation between a billionaire and a waitress was far from over. Claire looked up as Ethan stopped beside the table she had just finished cleaning. The restaurant had grown quieter. Only a handful of guests remained, their conversations blending into the soft background music. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan realized something unusual. He negotiated billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, yet finding the right words now seemed unexpectedly difficult. Claire noticed the business card in his hand and smiled politely. "Did you need anything else before you leave?" she asked. Ethan glanced at the card, then back at her. "Actually, yes." He placed it gently on the table between them. "If you ever decide you are tired of working here, call me." Claire looked at the card but made no move to pick it up. "That is generous," she said. "But I like working here." Ethan was not prepared for that answer. Most people reacted very differently when he offered opportunities. Some became excited. Others became nervous. A few tried too hard to impress him. Claire simply answered honestly. "You understand that this card could open a lot of doors," Ethan said. "I do. And that does not interest you?" Claire finally picked up the card and studied it for a second. "Opportunities interest me," she said. "But titles do not impress me nearly as much as people think they should." Ethan found himself smiling. There it was again. That quiet confidence. Not arrogance. Not defiance. Just clarity. Claire slipped the card into her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said. "That was kind." Ethan nodded. Then another question escaped before he could stop it. "Where did you learn all of that?" Claire tilted her head slightly. "All of what?" "Finance. Investing. Market behavior." For the first time all evening, something changed in her expression. Not fear. Not discomfort. Just hesitation. A small pause that seemed to carry years behind it. She looked toward the large windows overlooking the city lights. "I read." Ethan laughed softly. Nobody learns that level of analysis from casual reading. Claire's smile returned, but it was smaller now. More guarded. "You would be surprised what people can learn when they spend enough time paying attention." The answer revealed. Nothing and everything at the same time. Ethan knew she was avoiding the question, yet somehow he respected her for it. Everyone was entitled to their own story. "Fair enough," he said. Across the room, the restaurant manager called Claire's name. A customer needed assistance. She immediately turned toward the sound. Duty first. Curiosity second. Before walking away, she looked back at Ethan. "For what it is worth, I think your team will make the right decision tomorrow." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You sound confident." Claire adjusted the notepad in her hand. People usually know the right answer long before they admit it to themselves. Then she disappeared toward the front of the restaurant. Ethan stood there for several seconds watching her go. The words lingered in his mind. People usually know the right answer long before they admit it to themselves. It sounded less like financial advice and more like a life philosophy. Outside, a cool Manhattan breeze moved through the streets as Ethan finally left the restaurant. His driver opened the door of the waiting sedan. "Home, sir?" the driver asked. Ethan paused before getting inside. Through the restaurant window, he could still see Claire moving between tables beneath the warm lights. Ordinary uniform. Ordinary job. Extraordinary mind. "No," Ethan said quietly. "Office." The driver looked surprised. "At this hour?" Ethan climbed into the back seat and closed the door. "There is something I need to figure out." As the car pulled away from the curb, the city lights reflected across the window beside him. For the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell was not thinking about a competitor, an investor, or a business deal. He was thinking about a waitress named Claire Morgan and the growing suspicion that her story was far more remarkable than anyone imagined. The elevator doors opened onto the top floor of Caldwell Capital just after 11:30 that night. Most of the building was dark. The city beyond the glass walls shimmered beneath thousands of lights, but Ethan barely noticed. He walked directly to his office, loosened his tie, and sat behind the massive walnut desk where some of the biggest decisions of his career had been made. Yet instead of opening financial reports, he found himself thinking about a waitress. The thought was almost absurd. He knew it. Still, the curiosity remained. Ethan pressed a button on his desk phone. "Megan." A moment later, his executive assistant answered. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell. I need a background report." There was a brief pause. "On a company?" Ethan looked out toward the skyline. "On a person." Megan sounded surprised but professional. "Of course. Who?" Ethan hesitated for half a second. "Claire Morgan. She works at Le Claire restaurant in Midtown." "Understood. Nothing invasive," Ethan added. "Public records only. I will have something by morning." After ending the call, Ethan finally opened the acquisition reports. Yet every time he focused on numbers, his mind drifted back to the conversation from dinner. The strange thing was not that Claire understood finance. Brilliant people existed everywhere. The strange thing was how completely uninterested she seemed in proving she was brilliant. Most people spent their lives trying to be noticed. Claire appeared perfectly comfortable remaining invisible. Meanwhile, across the city, the restaurant had finally closed. Chairs were stacked. Lights were dimmed. Claire tied off a trash bag behind the service station before removing her apron. Her feet ached from 10 hours of work. Her shoulders felt heavy. Yet she moved through her closing duties without complaint. Another waitress named Sophie leaned against the counter. "You know that Billionaire was staring at you all night." Claire laughed softly. "He was not." "Claire," half the staff noticed. Sophie grinned. "Whatever happened over there?" Claire folded her apron neatly. "He asked a few questions." "A few questions?" Sophie shook her head. "The kitchen staff is already making up theories." Claire smiled but said nothing. She had learned long ago that attention rarely brought anything good. Quiet was safer. Predictable. Simple. 20 minutes later, she stepped outside into the cool Manhattan air. The streets were calmer now. Traffic had thinned. The city seemed to breathe differently after midnight. Claire began the familiar walk toward the subway station. As she passed a bookstore, she stopped briefly in front of the display window. A finance magazine sat among the featured publications. On the cover was Ethan Caldwell. She stared at it for a moment, then continued walking. Back in his office, Ethan received an email just after 1 in the morning. Preliminary report attached. He opened it immediately. Basic employment history, residential information, educational records. He expected very little. What he found made him sit upright. Claire Morgan, 27 years old, former student at Wharton School of Business. Academic honors, multiple scholarship awards, top percentile performance. Ethan read the page twice, then a third time. His eyes narrowed. None of it made sense. A woman with credentials like these should have been working at an investment firm, a hedge fund, or a major consulting company, not carrying dinner plates through a restaurant dining room. He scrolled further, then stopped. Her academic record ended abruptly 3 years earlier. No graduation, no corporate employment, no explanation, just a gap. Ethan leaned back slowly. The mystery had only grown deeper. Outside his office window, The city lights stretched endlessly into the darkness. Somewhere beneath them, Claire Morgan was heading home after another ordinary shift, completely unaware that a billionaire was staring at a report and realizing that the story she had chosen not to tell might be even more remarkable than he imagined. The next morning arrived with the pale gold light of sunrise spilling across Manhattan's glass towers. Ethan had slept less than 4 hours, yet the report on Claire Morgan remained open on his desk exactly where he had left it. He read it again while finishing his first cup of coffee. Top academic honors. Scholarship recipient. Exceptional performance in economics, finance, and quantitative analysis. Then suddenly, 3 years ago, the record ended. No degree. No prestigious internship. No corporate position. Nothing. The absence of information intrigued him more than the information itself. By 8 o'clock, his executive team had assembled for the acquisition review. Normally, meetings like this were dominated by confident opinions and competing strategies. Today felt different. Claire's questions still lingered over the room like an invisible presence. One by one, assumptions were challenged. Risks were reevaluated. Emotional attachment was stripped away from the numbers. By noon, the decision became unanimous. They would walk away from the deal, not because they lacked courage, but because they finally saw reality clearly. As the meeting ended, Richard remained behind. "You know," he said while gathering his documents, "that Waitress may have saved us hundreds of millions of dollars." Ethan stared through the office window at the city below. "I have been thinking the same thing." Richard smiled. "Are you going to tell her?" Ethan considered the question. "I'm not sure she would care." That answer made them both laugh. Meanwhile, across town, Claire's day looked very different. She sat beside a hospital window holding a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The room was quiet except for the gentle hum of medical equipment and distant footsteps in the hallway. Sitting beside her was her younger brother, Daniel, 22 years old, recovering steadily after a long medical struggle that had changed both of their lives. Daniel noticed the exhaustion in her face. "You worked another double shift." Claire smiled. "Someone has to keep the lights on. You could have had a completely different life." Claire looked toward the window. She had heard that sentence many times over the years. Friends had said it. Professors had said it. Even strangers occasionally said it after learning fragments of her story. Yet she never viewed her choices as sacrifices. They were simply decisions made when family needed her most. "Everyone has a different path," she replied softly. Daniel shook his head. "You were the smartest person in every room." Claire laughed. "That sounds very biased." "It is biased," he admitted. "But it is also true." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Familiar. Then Daniel studied her expression. "Something happened yesterday." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Why do you think that?" "Because you only stare out. Windows like that when you are thinking too much." She laughed again. A customer asked some unusual questions. And Claire hesitated. The memory of Ethan Caldwell came back unexpectedly. The confidence, the curiosity, the way he actually listened. "And nothing," she said finally. Yet even she knew that was not entirely true. Back at Caldwell Capital, Ethan requested the full report. It arrived shortly before 3 o'clock. As he opened the file, his attention immediately locked onto a section that had not appeared in the preliminary version. Academic withdrawal reason. Family medical hardship. Ethan read the sentence twice, then continued reading. The details were brief, respectful, and incomplete, but they revealed enough. Claire had not left because she failed. She had left because someone she loved needed her. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. The intelligence, the humility, the absence of bitterness, the complete lack of interest in impressing anyone. For years, while others chased titles and recognition, Claire Morgan had been carrying responsibilities far greater than a resume. And for the first time since reading her file, Ethan felt something deeper than curiosity. He felt respect. 3 days passed before Ethan returned to look Claire. He told himself the visit was about gratitude, about closure, about acknowledging someone whose insight had influenced a major decision. Yet as his car stopped outside the restaurant, he knew the truth was more complicated. Curiosity had become respect, and respect had become something he could not easily ignore. Inside, the dinner crowd filled the dining room with quiet conversation and the soft glow of candlelight. Claire was carrying a tray when she noticed him entering. For a brief moment, Surprise crossed her face. Then her usual calm expression returned. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Good evening, Claire." Somehow hearing her say his name felt different now. He knew part of her story, not all of it, but enough to understand that the woman standing before him had earned every ounce of the quiet confidence she carried. He was seated near the window. As the evening progressed, Claire checked on his table with the same professionalism she showed every guest. No special treatment, no expectation, no attempt to leverage their previous conversations. That only increased his admiration. Halfway through dinner, Ethan's phone buzzed. A message from Richard appeared. Acquisition officially terminated. Investor response overwhelmingly positive. Projected savings exceeded initial estimates. Ethan stared at the screen. Hundreds of millions of dollars protected. Months of future complications avoided. He slowly placed the phone down. A few minutes later, Claire arrived with a fresh glass of water. "Everything all right?" she asked. Ethan looked up at her. "Actually, yes." He paused. "Better than all right." Claire waited politely. Ethan smiled. The decision worked. Her expression softened slightly. "That is good to hear. It saved an extraordinary amount of money." Claire nodded once. "Then your team deserves credit." Ethan laughed quietly. "You really are determined not to take any." Claire adjusted the water pitcher. "I only asked a question nobody else asked." She did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the city lights outside the window. Sometimes people become so focused on solving a problem that they forget to step back and look at it differently. Ethan studied her face. The humility was genuine. That was what made it so rare. Most people wanted ownership of success. Claire seemed content simply helping. "Would you sit for a moment?" Ethan asked. Claire looked around the dining room. It was not especially busy. After a brief hesitation, she pulled out the chair across from him. 1 minute. Ethan nodded. 1 minute. For the first time, they spoke without menus, business deals, or investment questions between them. Ethan told her about the positive investor response. Claire listened carefully. Then she asked thoughtful questions that revealed she understood far more than she let people see. Finally, Ethan asked the question that had been waiting for days. "Do you ever regret it?" Claire looked puzzled. "Regret what?" "Leaving school." A quiet silence settled between them. Claire's gaze lowered briefly before returning to his. "Some days are harder than others," she admitted. "But regret is not the word I would use." Ethan listened. "My brother needed me." The choice was clear. There was no self-pity in her voice. No bitterness. Just acceptance. Ethan found that remarkable. Most people would have been angry. Claire smiled faintly. Anger does not pay hospital bills. The honesty of the answer left him speechless for a moment. Then she continued. "Life rarely gives perfect options. Sometimes it simply asks who matters most." Across the dining room, someone called her name. Another table needed assistance. Claire stood. "My minute is up." Ethan smiled. "I suppose it is." She began to walk away, then stopped. "For what it is worth, I am glad the decision worked out." Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd. And for the first time, he realized that the most valuable thing Claire Morgan had given him was not financial advice. It was perspective. Several months passed. Winter gave way to spring, and spring slowly surrendered to the warmth of early summer. The acquisition Ethan had walked away from became one of the most discussed business stories of the year. Analysts praised the decision. Investors celebrated it. Financial magazines called it a masterclass in discipline and leadership. More than once, reporters asked Ethan what had influenced his thinking during that critical moment. Each time, he offered a polite answer and changed the subject. Some stories belonged to the people who lived them. During those same months, Claire's life remained remarkably unchanged. She still worked at Leclerc. She still spent time helping Daniel through his recovery. She still rode the subway home after long shifts and stopped at the same coffee stand on quiet mornings. If anything, she seemed even more determined to keep her life simple. One evening in June, Ethan returned to the restaurant again. By now, the staff recognized him. A few greeted him warmly as he entered. Claire spotted him from across the dining room and shook her head with a small smile. "You know there are other restaurants in New York," she said as she approached his table. Ethan smiled back. "I have been told that." Claire handed him a menu. "And yet you keep coming back." "Maybe I like the service." She laughed softly. "That sounds suspiciously diplomatic." For a moment, they simply enjoyed the familiar conversation. No billion-dollar decisions. No complicated questions. Just two people talking. Later that evening, after the dinner rush slowed, Ethan placed a folder on the table. Claire looked at it curiously. What is this? Open it. She hesitated before doing so. Inside was information about a scholarship fund. Not for her. For students who had been forced to pause their education because of family hardship. Claire looked up immediately. Ethan noticed genuine surprise in her eyes. You started this? She asked quietly. Ethan nodded. It seemed like a good idea. Claire studied the pages again. Several students would receive support every year. Tuition assistance, living expenses, resources designed to help them continue their education without abandoning family responsibilities. She closed the folder slowly. This is going to change lives. I hope so. Claire stared at him for a long moment. Why? Ethan glanced out the window where city lights shimmered against the evening sky. Because someone reminded me that talent exists everywhere. Sometimes it is simply hidden behind responsibilities other people cannot see. Neither spoke for a few seconds. The silence felt comfortable, meaningful. Claire finally smiled. You know, most people would have spent the money on something much less useful. Ethan laughed. I am beginning to notice that you have opinions about everything. Only the important things. Across the restaurant, Daniel entered carrying a small bag of takeout food. His recovery had progressed well. He looked healthier now, stronger. Claire waved him over. After introductions, the three shared a brief conversation filled with easy laughter and simple observations about life in New York. Watching them together, Ethan understood something he had missed for years. Success was not always measured by headlines, stock prices, or wealth. Sometimes success looked like a sister who refused to give up on her family. Sometimes it looked like quiet strength that nobody noticed until the right question was asked. As the evening came to an end, Ethan stood to leave. Claire walked him toward the door. Thank you, she said. Ethan looked genuinely confused. For what? Claire smiled. For listening. Outside, the city continued its endless motion. Taxis passed. Lights glowed. People hurried toward destinations that seemed urgent. Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk and looked back through the restaurant window. Claire was already helping another customer, carrying menus and smiling politely as though she had never changed anyone's life. Maybe that was the lesson he would remember most. The world often celebrates the loudest voices in the room, but sometimes the person who changes everything is the one nobody notices at first. And sometimes the greatest wisdom arrives wearing an apron, carrying a water pitcher, and asking people to see what has been there all along.